She won't need any of this where she's going, Vanessa said, dropping my wife's wedding coat into a black garbage bag 2 days before we had even buried her. Nobody in that closet moved. A wire hanger kept swinging on the empty rod, ticking softly against the wood like a clock counting down something none of us could stop. No one coughed, no one apologized. Only the crinkle of plastic answered her, bag after bag. 45 years of my marriage folded down into 6 sacks, stacked by the garage door, like inventory nobody wanted anymore. Was any of it real, this family I thought I had raised with my own hands? Had Margaret known somehow exactly what her children would do the moment her heart stopped beating, and what could possibly matter enough that she would rather sew it into fabric than simply tell me herself? My name is Walter Hale. I am 74 years old, a retired marine cargo surveyor who spent 40 years learning to read the difference between a hull that would hold and a hull that would quietly rot from the inside. 3 days from that closet, I would stand at my wife's graveside. But in that moment, all I could do was watch my son's wife decide what 45 years of love was worth to a thrift store. Nathaniel, my eldest, stood by the window scrolling through his phone, not even looking up as his wife worked. My daughter Claire lingered in the doorway, arms crossed tight over her chest, saying nothing, doing nothing, her eyes flicking toward me once and then away, fast, like she'd been caught at something. Her husband Marcus carried the bags out 2 at a time, whistling under his breath as if he were hauling old newspapers to the curb. I did not shout. I did not grab the bag from Vanessa's hands. I felt something in my chest lock shut. The same reflex I had trained into myself decades ago on the deck of cargo ships, the moment before you have to tell a captain his hull has failed inspection, and there is nothing anyone can do to change what the steel already knows. I turned, walked down to my workshop in the basement, and picked up an old brass caliper I had carried in my coat pocket for 40 years. I ran my thumb along its teeth until my hands stopped shaking. I did not go back upstairs. I let them finish. Margaret had built an empire out of nothing but her own stubbornness and a mind for logistics that made grown executives nervous in board meetings. Wallace Regional Freight had grown, over 4 decades, from 3 leased trucks into a $32 million company with warehouses on 2 coasts. Everyone who read about her in the trade magazines assumed she had done it alone. I let them believe that. I sold my own surveying firm 40 years ago and poured every dollar into her company when the banks would not, because I loved watching her become who she was always meant to be, and because I never needed my name on the door to know what I had built beside her. That quiet had cost me more than I understood until the day I watched my children give away her coats, before her body was even in the ground. The funeral was small, exactly as Margaret would have wanted, held on a gray Thursday morning at the cemetery behind the old stone chapel, where we were married 45 years earlier. I stood at the graveside in the black suit I had worn to every funeral of my adult life, listening to a minister who had never met my wife describe her as a visionary businesswoman, a title that felt both true and somehow smaller than everything she actually was to me. Nathaniel gave a eulogy about legacy and leadership. He did not mention that his mother used to hum off-key while doing the dishes, or that she kept a jar of sea glass on her desk from our honeymoon, or that she called me her keel, the thing that kept her steady when the water got rough. He talked about market share. 2 days later, the family gathered in the same dining room where Margaret and I had hosted 40 Thanksgivings for the reading of the will. The estate attorney, a clipped, efficient man named Harold Finch, sat at the head of the long table with a folder of documents thick enough to require its own briefcase. Nathaniel and Claire sat across from me, their spouses hovering behind them like seconds at a duel. I sat alone at the far end, my hands folded on the polished wood, still faintly smelling of the incense from the chapel. I did not know it yet, but everything that mattered in that room had already been decided years before any of us sat down at that table. Finch read through the assets in a flat, practiced voice. The operating company, Wallace Regional Freight, its fleet, its warehouses, its downtown headquarters building, the 2 lake houses, the city apartment, all divided evenly between Nathaniel and Claire. With every line, I watched my son's shoulders relax further into his chair, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his mouth like a man watching a scoreboard tick up in his favor. Vanessa reached over and squeezed his hand under the table. Claire stared down at her lap, and for one strange second, I thought I saw something like shame cross her face before she smoothed it away. Then Finch paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked down the table at me. To my husband Walter, he read, "I leave a debt I can never repay, and a single sealed letter, to be opened only by his own hand." He slid a small cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It was thin, lighter than a receipt. Nathaniel let out a short, sharp laugh before he could stop himself. "A letter," he said, shaking his head. Swirling the ice in a glass of scotch he had poured himself from my own liquor cabinet an hour earlier. "That's it? After everything, that's what she left the man who mowed her lawn for 40 years? "Nate," Claire said quietly. But it wasn't quite a protest. It was closer to a flinch. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dripping with a gentleness so manufactured it made my skin crawl. "Walter, we've talked about it, and we want you to know we're not going to leave you out in the cold. We can set you up with a nice one-bedroom somewhere, and we'll wire you $1,000 a month so you're never without. But we'll need the master suite by Friday. We've already got a design team coming through this weekend to talk about the renovation." $1,000. Offered like alms, in the house I had spent 4 decades paying the mortgage on. By children I had personally taught to ride bicycles and balance checkbooks, and tell the truth even when it cost them something. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the small cream envelope, slid it into my coat pocket, and stood up from the table without a word. Nathaniel called something after me about not being dramatic. I did not turn around. I want to tell you, I already suspected what waited inside that envelope. I did not. I only knew that Margaret Hale did not do anything without a reason, and if her final message to me fit inside an envelope thin enough to slip under a door, then whatever mattered most had been hidden somewhere else entirely. I found the answer to that question 40 minutes later, standing in the empty walk-in closet where, 2 days before, I had watched my daughter-in-law fill 6 garbage bags with my wife's life. I opened the small cream envelope alone in the greenhouse, the one place in that entire estate that still felt like it belonged to me. Inside was a single line, written in Margaret's unmistakable, slanted hand, the same handwriting that used to leave notes in my lunch thermos 40 years ago when I still worked the docks, tying my navy coat, the one with the brass buttons, the one I wore, the day you asked me to marry you. Everything I could not say out loud is sewn into the lining. Find it before they do, Walter. I am so sorry I ran out of time to tell you myself. My hands went cold before my mind caught up to what I was reading. The navy coat. The brass buttons. I knew exactly which coat she meant because I had watched Vanessa fold it into a garbage bag 2 days earlier without a second glance, the same way you might fold up an old bath towel. I did not know it yet, but I had less than 6 hours to find a single coat inside a city of nearly 1 million people. I went straight to the housekeeper, Ines, who had worked for our family for 11 years, and who alone in that house still looked at me like a human being, rather than a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. She told me, eyes down, clearly ashamed to be delivering the news, that Vanessa had called a donation service 2 mornings before the funeral, a charity outfit called Helping Hands that ran a thrift shop downtown and did same-day pickups for estate cleanouts. 6 bags gone before noon. She had tried to set aside a box of what she thought were sentimental items, she said, but Vanessa had specifically told the driver to take everything. Coats included, no exceptions. Same-day pickup meant the coat could already be tagged, sorted, priced, sold to a stranger for $11 while my son sat in my dining room drinking my scotch and calling my grief a formality. I did not call Nathaniel. I did not call Claire. I got into my old truck, the one none of them had bothered to appraise, because it wasn't worth their time, and I drove across town to Helping Hands with a photograph of Margaret, wearing that coat still saved on my phone from our 40th anniversary. The woman behind the counter, a heavy-set volunteer named Doris with reading glasses on a beaded chain, told me that donations from large estate pickups typically got sorted within 48 hours and moved straight to the sales floor, no holding period, no exceptions. First come, first served. She pulled up the intake log on an ancient desktop computer and told me the batch from our address had come in the day before yesterday. Some of it, she said, had already gone out to the floor that morning. I did not know it yet, but I was about to spend the next 90 minutes of my life on my knees in a thrift store, going through racks of strangers' donated coats, one hanger at a time, praying to a wife I had just buried that I was not too late. I found it on the third rack, wedged between a man's tweed blazer and a child's puffy winter jacket, a small orange price tag stapled through the collar. $8. 45 years of marriage, priced at $8, hanging 3 feet from the door, where anyone could have walked in and taken it home without ever knowing what they carried out with them. My hands shook so badly it took me 2 tries to get my wallet open. I paid Doris in cash, thanked her more times than the transaction warranted, and carried that coat out of the store pressed against my chest like a man carrying something wounded. I did not open my truck door right away. I stood in the parking lot in the gray afternoon light and pressed my face into the collar, and for the first time since Margaret died, I let myself cry, loud, ugly, unguarded, the kind of crying I had not allowed myself even at the graveside because I had children watching and old habits about what a man was supposed to look like in front of his family. I drove to a motel on the edge of town that night, not because I had nowhere else to go yet, but because I could not stand to sleep another night under a roof where my own children had decided what my grief was worth. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress under a buzzing fluorescent light and laid the coat across my lap like it might still be warm. I ran my hands along the lining, slow, deliberate, the same careful patience I used to run along a ship's hull, looking for the seam that didn't sit quite right. And there it was, along the inside left panel, a line of stitching slightly different from the rest, tighter, newer, done by a hand that was not a factory machine but a woman working late at night with a needle and a secret. I did not know it yet, but I was about to cut open the last message my wife would ever give me, and it was going to change everything I understood about the woman I had married. I found a small pair of scissors in the motel's shaving kit, and, with hands that had not shaken this badly since the day our first child was born, I carefully picked apart 3 inches of stitching along the seam. Something small and hard slid out into my palm. A brass key, old-fashioned, the kind used for a physical safety deposit box rather than any digital vault. Folded around it was a single sheet of onion skin paper, worn soft from being handled and refolded many times before it was ever sewn away. I unfolded it under the weak motel lamp. Margaret's handwriting again, but longer, this time unhurried. The handwriting of a woman who had known she was running out of time and had decided exactly how she wanted to spend what remained of it. Walter, if you are reading this, they have already shown you who they've become, and I am so sorry I did not stop it while I still had the strength to. I always knew what our children were capable of when the money finally landed in their hands. I hoped I was wrong. I built the company in my name because it was easier for the world to accept a woman running a freight empire than to accept the truth, that the man behind it, the man who sold everything he owned to save it in year 3, never once asked for credit. The company they will inherit is only half of what we built. The other half, the half that actually holds everything together, was never mine to leave to children who see people as line items. It is yours, Walter. It was always going to be yours. Go to First Meridian Trust downtown, box 214. Ask for a man named Alistair Vance. He has been waiting longer than you know. I sat on that motel bed for a long time after I finished reading, the key resting warm in my palm from my own grip, and I understood for the first time in 45 years of marriage that my wife had been carrying a weight I never let myself see, because she had spent our whole life together making sure I never had to. I did not know it yet, but the woman I had loved for 4.5 decades had built one final, brilliant piece of engineering before she died, and my children had just spent the last 3 days handing her every piece of evidence she would ever need. First Meridian Trust did not look like a bank. It looked like a private library that had wandered into the financial district by accident, 4 stories of gray stone with no signage on the street, Just a brass plate beside a heavy door with the name etched small enough that you had to already know it was there. I gave my name to a woman at a desk in a marble foyer, and before I had finished spelling it, a door opened at the far end of the hall and a tall man in his 60s came out with his hand already extended. "Mr. Hale," he said. "Alistair Vance. I have been waiting 11 years for this appointment." He had the calm of a man who had spent his professional life holding other people's secrets and had never once dropped one. He took me down a corridor lined with old maritime charts, which I understood later was not a coincidence, and into an office with a single window and a desk with nothing on it but a blotter and a phone. "How much did she tell you?" he asked. "She told me almost nothing," I said. "She told me for 45 years that I was her keel, and she never once told me what she was carrying." Vance nodded slowly, and something in his face changed. "That's about what I expected. Mr. Hale, I want to say something before we begin, and I want you to know it isn't a formality. Your wife spoke about you in this office more than she spoke about her own business. She used to say she'd built a company that would outlive her and married a man who'd already outlived his own better judgment by marrying her. Then she'd laugh. She had a very specific laugh. 2 notes, I said. Down, then up. 2 notes, he agreed. Yes. I had to look at the window for a moment. Then he opened a drawer and took out a folder that had clearly been sitting there a long time, and he began patiently, in plain English, to explain what my wife had actually done. Wallace Regional Freight, the company my children had just inherited, was the part everyone could see. The trucks, the drivers, the payroll, the contracts, the name painted on the side of every trailer on the interstate. What it did not include, and had not included for the last 11 years, was the ground any of it stood on. 11 years ago, Margaret had moved the physical assets and the operating systems out from under the company and into a separate holding trust, the warehouses, the depot land, the downtown headquarters building, the routing and dispatch software the entire fleet ran on, which she and I had drafted the first version of together on graph paper at our kitchen table in 1987, back when I was still doing hull surveys, and she was still driving one of the trucks herself on weekends. All of it sat in a trust with one beneficiary. Me, Wallace Regional Freight, did not own its buildings. It leased them. It did not own its dispatch platform, it licensed it. And for 11 years Margaret had quietly waived the fees on both, because the money was moving from her left hand to her right hand, and there was no reason to make the accountants do the paperwork. When she died, Vance said, the waiver died with her. It was written to. As of the date of her death, the trust is obligated to collect, not permitted. Obligated. She made it a duty, not an option, so that no one could ever pressure you into forgiving it out of guilt. I sat with that for a while. She thought of everything, I said. She thought of one thing, Vance said. She thought of you. I asked him the question I had been carrying since the motel room. Why hide it? Why not simply tell me, or tell them, or write it into the will where everyone could see it? He was quiet for a moment before he answered. Because she wanted them to have the chance to be decent, he said. The will was a test, Mr. Hale. She left them everything visible and left you a letter, and she wanted to see what they'd do with a father who appeared to have nothing. If they had treated you well, you'd have opened that envelope, come to me, and folded them into the trust as beneficiaries within the year. That was the plan. She wrote it out. I have it in the file. He tapped the folder. She just didn't tell you, because if you'd known, you'd have gone easy on them. She knew you. She said you'd have handed it over the first time one of them cried. He was right. I would have. I want to be honest about something here, because I have spent my life being honest about the condition of things even when nobody wanted to hear it. And I am not going to start lying about myself now. That first week after the funeral, I could not go into a grocery store. I tried twice. Both times I got as far as the second aisle, the one with the canned soup, and had to leave the cart in the middle of the floor and walk out, because Margaret always sent me for the store-brand tomato soup and made a face about it, and I could not stand in front of that shelf and be a man who was allowed to buy anything he wanted. A stock boy chased me out to the parking lot the second time to ask if I was all right. I told him I'd forgotten my wallet. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes. I tell you this because in the weeks that followed, people started describing me as cold and calculating, and I wanted on the record that I was neither. I was a man who could not buy soup. Vance laid out the options across the desk like charts. I could file immediately, publicly, and dare them to fight it. He advised against it. If my name went on the first document my children saw, they would hire litigators and drag the estate into probate court for 3 years, arguing that Margaret had been unduly influenced by an old man in the last years of her life, and by the time it resolved I might not be alive to see it. Instead, he suggested something quieter. The trust would send a routine notice of arrears, standard commercial paper, from a holding entity with a name that meant nothing, addressed to accounts payable, demanding overdue lease payments and licensing fees. In their current state, they would file it as somebody else's problem. And when they ignore it, Vance said, they will be in default and everything after that will be ours. I agreed. But I told him I wanted one condition, and I told him it in a voice that surprised me. Whatever we do, nothing gets released to the public that a lawyer hasn't cleared first. I'm not going to become the thing they already think I am. Vance smiled slightly. She said you'd say that too. The notice went out on a Tuesday. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no logo, no red stamp, nothing to distinguish it from an invoice for office coffee service. And by Thursday morning it had reached the top floor of the downtown headquarters building that my son believed he owned. He never opened it. I know this because of a man named Ruben Ortega, who had loaded trailers for Wallace Regional for 26 years, worked his way up to yard supervisor, and had come to my house for dinner 4 times a year for 2 decades. Ruben called me the day after the notice landed, not because he'd been asked to, but because Nathaniel had walked through the yard that morning and announced that overtime was suspended indefinitely, while the new leadership rationalized the cost structure. And Ruben wanted to know if I'd heard. He also mentioned, almost in passing, that a courier had come by looking for a signature on something from a holding company, and that Nathaniel had told the front desk to route all Vanner noise to accounting and stop bothering him with it. I thanked him. I did not tell him what it meant. Then I asked him how the men were doing, and he was quiet for a second. And he said, Walter, they're scared. Half the yard thinks the son's going to sell the whole thing for parts before Christmas. I told him it wouldn't come to that. I meant it as a comfort. It turned out to be a promise. What Nathaniel was doing instead of reading his mail was borrowing against a building that was not his. He had gone to a private lender with a proposal for a personal credit facility, $22 million, collateralized against the downtown headquarters, with a personal guarantee attached, because he wanted the money fast, and the guarantee made it faster. He signed it with a fountain pen in a conference room, full of people telling him he was visionary. The compliance review on the title was scheduled to be routine and slow, the way these things always are, which is the only reason the money moved at all. Vanessa spent the first tranche in 11 days. $140,000 on jewelry, a lease on a car that cost more than the house I raised my children in, and a deposit on a beach property in the Carolinas that she put in her own name only. I did not learn that last part until later, and when I did, a great many things clicked into place at once. Claire and Marcus were meanwhile treating the company's operating account like a checking account with a bottomless floor. Marcus had a real estate venture that had been quietly bleeding money for 2 years, an unfinished development outside Charlotte that had missed 3 construction deadlines, and he had begun moving company funds into it under a line item called Regional Expansion Analysis. Claire signed the approvals. I have wondered many times since whether she read them, and in the middle of all of it, on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after we buried Margaret, my granddaughter Poppy called me on her mother's phone. She was 6. She wanted to know why I didn't live in the big house anymore. I told her that sometimes grown-ups have to move around and it isn't anybody's fault, which is the lie. Every adult tells a child about a divorce or a death or an eviction, and she accepted it for about 4 seconds. Then she said, but if Grandma's stuff is all gone and you're gone too, then who's left that remembers her? I sat down on the edge of the motel bed with the phone against my ear and could not answer her for a long moment. I do, I said finally. I remember her. Okay, she said, satisfied. Then don't go anywhere. Then she asked if I could come to her school thing in October, and hung up before I could say yes. I have thought about that question more than I have thought about any legal document in this entire story. Who's left that remembers her? Everything I did afterward, every hard thing, I did because a 6-year-old asked me a question that nobody in that dining room had thought to ask. The default matured on a Friday. Vance called me at 9:15 that morning to tell me that 30 days had elapsed, that the notice had been delivered and signed for by an employee of the company, that no payment and no response of any kind had been recorded, and that as of that moment, Wallace Regional Freight was in breach of both its master lease and its software licensing agreement. The numbers were not small. 11 years of accrued fees, calculated at the contractual rate Margaret had set in 2014 and then generously waived every quarter since, came to just under $19 million. The lease alone, if enforced, entitled the trust to begin recovery of the properties. The licensing default entitled the trust to suspend access to the dispatch platform, which meant that within 24 hours of the switch being thrown, 406 trucks would have no routing, no load assignments, and no way to bill a customer. I can shut them down by Monday, Vance said. Say the word. I told him no, he waited. Those trucks have drivers in them, I said. Ruben Ortega has a daughter starting college in the fall. I'm not turning off a system 400 families eat from because I'm angry at 2 people. There was a pause on the line, and then Vance said, in a voice with something new in it, Then what would you like to do, Mr. Hale? I told him to carve the drivers out. Direct assurance to the workforce in writing, from the trust, that payroll and operations would continue uninterrupted regardless of the outcome of any dispute at the executive level, and that the trust would fund payroll directly if the operating company failed to. It cost me a great deal of money to say that sentence. It is the only decision in this entire story I have never once questioned. And the rest? He asked. The rest, I said, we do in a room where everybody can see it. The room chose itself. Margaret had, in her last healthy year, arranged for the company to hold a 40th anniversary dedication at the downtown building. A Saturday evening event with a bronze plaque going up in the lobby, employees invited with their families, food, a short program, the kind of thing she would have hated attending and insisted on paying for. She had put the deposit down herself. The date was already on the calendar when she died, and Nathaniel, rather than cancel it, had seized on it as a public relations opportunity and expanded it into something with press invitations and a step-and-repeat banner. He was going to use his mother's memorial dedication to announce himself. I told Vance we would be attending. There is one more thing I have to tell you about that month, and it is the part I have the hardest time telling. 2 weeks before the dedication, Claire came to find me. She showed up at the motel, which meant she had asked Ines where I was, which meant she had gone looking. She stood in the parking lot in a coat that cost more than the room, and she did not come inside. She said she wanted to give me something, and she handed me a shoebox, and inside it were 4 things that Vanessa had bagged for donation, and that Claire had apparently pulled out of the bag when nobody was watching, and hidden in the trunk of her car for 3 weeks. Margaret's reading glasses, the jar of sea glass from our honeymoon, a photograph of the 4 of us at Lake Placid in 1994, and one of Margaret's cardigans, folded badly, the way you fold something when you are in a hurry and afraid. I looked at the box for a long time. Why didn't you stop her? I asked. Claire's face did something I had not seen since she was 9 years old, and broke a window with a softball and stood in the kitchen, deciding whether to lie about it. Because Nate said you'd be fine, she said. Because it was easier to believe him. Her voice cracked in the middle. Because if I said something, I'd have had to admit what we were doing, and I wasn't ready to be a person who'd done that. I did not hug her. I want to be honest about that. I stood in a motel parking lot, holding a shoebox with my wife's reading glasses in it, and I did not hug my daughter, because I was not ready either, and because there was a large part of me still standing in that closet, listening to a hanger swing on an empty rod. She got back in her car and drove away, and I went inside and sat with the box on my knees until it got dark. I want to say for the record, before everything that comes next, she came. Before she knew there was any money in it, before she knew I had anything at all. When every reason she had to visit me was a reason that cost her something and gained her nothing, she came, and she brought me my wife's glasses. I did not know it yet, but 2 weeks later, in a lobby full of cameras, that would turn out to matter more than every document in Alistair Vance's folder. The Saturday of the dedication came in clear and cold. I put on the charcoal suit Margaret had bought me in Milan for our 40th anniversary, the one I had never worn because I said it was too good to waste on me, and she said that was the entire point. In the inside pocket, folded flat, I carried a coat lining, 3 inches of picked stitching, and a sheet of onion skin paper in my wife's handwriting. At 5:40 that evening, I walked through the revolving doors of a building my son had spent 30 days borrowing against and had never once owned. The lobby of the Wallace Regional Freight Building had been rebuilt for the evening into something that did not resemble a workplace at all. Someone had trucked in white floral arrangements the size of shrubs. There was a bar. There was a step and repeat banner with the company logo tiled across it and a photographer stationed in front of it. There were 4 reporters from the trade press and 1 from the city paper, and there was, at the far end of the marble floor, under a black cloth, the bronze plaque my wife had commissioned for her own company's 40th year, without ever intending to be alive for the unveiling. There were also, standing in loose clusters along the walls in clean shirts and pressed jeans, about 60 people who actually worked there. Drivers, dockhands, dispatchers, 2 mechanics who had come straight from the yard and still had grease under their fingernails. They had been invited because Margaret had written them into the guest list herself a year and a half earlier, and nobody had thought to take them off it. I saw Ruben Ortega by the elevators. He saw me. He did not wave. He just straightened up slightly, the way a man does when the situation has changed and he is not sure how yet. Nathaniel spotted me from across the room and crossed it in about 9 seconds. "You need to leave," he said, low, close to my ear, one hand on my elbow like he was steering a piece of furniture. "There is press here." "Your mother put this on the calendar," I said. "I'm on the list." "You are not on any list. I'm on her list." He looked at me then, actually looked, and I watched him register the suit. I watched him do the arithmetic on what that suit cost and fail to make it balance against the man he had told everyone I was. "Where did you get that?" he said. "Milan," I said. 40 years and 11 days ago. He let go of my elbow and stepped back, and Vanessa arrived beside him the way weather arrives, all at once. "Walter," she said brightly, for the benefit of the 2 people within earshot. "You came." Then, quieter, still smiling, her voice pitched exactly low enough to stay off the record. "You have got to be kidding me." "It's a memorial for my wife," I said. "It's a business event. It's a plaque with her name on it. It's a brand event." She said it the way you'd correct a child's grammar. And then she said the thing I have replayed more times than I would like to admit, because I think she genuinely believed it was the winning move. "Honestly, Walter, do you want to know what you were to her? You were a tax write-off. She kept you around because it looked good on the profile pieces to have the humble husband in the greenhouse. That's it. That's the whole marriage." The photographer's flash went off somewhere behind her. I felt my hand go into my coat pocket and close around 3 inches of picked stitching. "Say that again," I said. "I don't need to say it twice." "No," I said. "You don't." Nathaniel had gone slightly pale, not because his wife had insulted his dead mother in her own lobby, but because a reporter 20 feet away had stopped mid-conversation and turned her head. He recovered the way he always recovered, by getting louder. "Dad." He put a hand up, palm out, performing patience for the room. "This is exactly what I was worried about. You're grieving, you're not thinking clearly, and this is not the venue." He half turned toward the security desk. "Marty, could you help my father find his car?" 2 guards started across the marble. I did not move. I had spent 4 decades standing on the decks of ships telling men twice my size that their vessel was not going anywhere, and I had learned a long time ago that the trick is simply not moving. "Nathaniel," I said, "before those men reach me, I want you to think about one thing, Dad. Whose building is this? He laughed. It came out wrong, a half second too late and a half note too high. It's my building. Are you sure? The guards were 8 feet away. And that is when Alistair Vance walked in. He came through the revolving door with 2 forensic accountants behind him and a leather folder under his arm. And he did not raise his voice, and he did not hurry. And he said one sentence that stopped both guards where they stood. Gentlemen, if either of you puts a hand on that man, you will be terminated by the owner of this property before you reach the door, and I will personally see that neither of you works private security in this state again. The taller guard looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel's mouth was open. Marty, Vance said pleasantly, you have worked in this lobby for 9 years, and your employer of record is not Wallace Regional Freight. Check your last pay stub at your convenience. Meridian Property Holdings. Take 3 steps back. Marty took 3 steps back. The lobby had gone very quiet. Not theatrically quiet, the real kind, where a room of 200 people stops talking in ragged waves as each cluster figures out that something is happening. Vance walked to the small table where the plaque program had been laid out, set his folder down on it, and opened it. For the benefit of the room, he said, my name is Alistair Vance. I represent the Hale Family Trust. The trust holds fee title to this building, to the 4 distribution facilities in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, and to the dispatch and routing platform on which every truck in this company's fleet currently operates. Wallace Regional Freight leases this floor. It licenses that software. It has done so for 11 years. Nathaniel said, that's not. It has been in default on both agreements since the 17th of last month, Vance continued. Following a notice of arrears delivered to this address and signed for by an employee of this company, which was neither answered nor paid. That was a vendor invoice, Nathaniel said. And I watched the exact instant he heard himself say it out loud. It was, Vance agreed. We are the vendor. Claire had come through the crowd. She had a champagne flute in her hand that she was not drinking from, and she was staring at me, not at Vance, and I could see her working it out several seconds ahead of her brother. Marcus was on his phone by the wall, turned away, talking fast. You're lying, Nathaniel said. His voice had climbed. My mother built this company. She owned this building. It was in the will. It cleared probate. I have the documents. You have documents describing an operating company, Vance said. An operating company is a set of contracts and a payroll. It is not real estate. Your mother separated the two in 2014. Why would she do that? And that is when I stepped forward, and Vance stopped talking, and the room turned. Because she didn't do it, I said. We did. I want to be careful here about how I say this next part, because there were 200 people in that room, and about half of them had spent decades believing a version of this company's history that was not true, and I did not stand up in front of them to take something away from my wife. I stood up to add something back. In 1987, this company had 3 trucks and a note it couldn't service, I said. I had a marine survey firm with 9 employees in a building on Water Street. In the spring of that year, I sold all of it. Every asset, every contract, the building, my own name on the door, and I put the entire proceeds into Wallace Regional Freight, because the woman who ran it was the smartest operator I have ever met in my life, and the banks could not see it. I did not want the title. I never wanted the title. I wanted her to have the room to be who she was. Somebody near the back said something I couldn't hear. The dispatch system, I said, was drawn up on graph paper at our kitchen table over about 4 months, most of it after midnight. She did the network math. I did the load tolerances. The reason it schedules the way it does, the reason it will not let a dispatcher overweight a trailer even when the customer is screaming, is because I spent 40 years watching what happens to steel that carries more than it was rated for. I looked at my son. Your mother put those assets in trust 11 years ago because she was already sick, and she knew she'd be gone before me, and she wanted to be certain that when it happened, the ground under this company belonged to somebody who would not sell it. You're saying she didn't trust her own children, Nathaniel said. I'm saying she gave you a test, I said, and I'd have failed it on your behalf. If any one of you had come to me in that dining room and said, Dad, come stay with us. We'll figure it out together. I'd have opened that letter and folded you into the trust before Thanksgiving. Mr. Vance has her written instruction to that effect in his file. She wrote it in her own hand. You had 30 days and a father sleeping in a motel. And none of you called except to ask when I'd be out of the master suite. That's not fair, Nathaniel said. You never told us any of this. 40 years and you never said one word about selling your company, about any of it, and there it was. No, I said. I didn't. The room waited. That one's mine, I said. You're right. I stayed quiet for 40 years because I thought quiet was the same as strong, and I let the two of you grow up believing your father was decorative. I never once corrected the record at a dinner table. I never told you what I gave up, because I thought telling you would look like asking for credit, and you built your whole idea of me out of a silence I chose. My voice did something I did not authorize. That is the one thing in this room I would take back, and I can't. Nathaniel's jaw moved. For a moment, half a second, something came up in his face that was not calculation. Then Vanessa put her hand on his arm and said, Nate, don't. And Claire put her glass down on the table hard enough that it rang. Stop it, she said. She was not talking to me. She had turned to face her brother and his wife, and she was shaking, and she was doing it in front of 4 reporters and 60 employees, and a photographer who had stopped taking pictures. Claire, Vanessa said, warning. No. You bagged her coats, Vanessa. Claire's voice went up and cracked, and she kept going anyway. You called a truck. She wasn't in the ground yet, and you called a truck. And I stood in the doorway, and I watched you do it, and I didn't say a word, and I have not slept right since. She turned to the room. That's what happened. 2 days before the funeral. I want somebody who isn't us to know that. Claire, shut up, Nathaniel said. He couldn't buy soup, she said. Nobody understood that except me. I went to see him, she said. 3 weeks ago. He's been living in a motel off Route 9, and he couldn't get through a grocery store, and we were shopping for marble. She was crying now, badly, the ugly kind, and she did not stop or excuse it. That is the moment the room turned, and it did not turn because of a document. What happened next I did not arrange, and I want that understood. Ruben Ortega walked away from the elevators and came and stood next to me. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood at my left shoulder, with his hands folded in front of him like a man at a graveside. Then Denise Pryor, who had been a dispatcher for 19 years, walked over from the bar and stood on my right. Then 2 of the mechanics. Then a driver named Cal, who had once helped me move a piano. Then 4 more from the loading side. Then a woman from accounts receivable, whose name I am ashamed to say I did not know then and do know now, and inside of a minute there were somewhere between 30 and 40 people standing in a loose half-circle around an old man in a Milan suit, not cheering, not saying anything at all, just standing there. That was the loudest thing that happened all night. Nathaniel looked at them, and something in his posture came apart. This is a coup, he said. You've turned my own staff. Nobody turned anybody, Ruben said. You suspended overtime on a Tuesday and told us to be grateful. Vance cleared his throat. Once in the room came back to him. There is a further matter, he said, and I would prefer to raise it privately. He looked at me. This was the thing we had discussed in his office. 2 days earlier, the thing I had insisted we would not read aloud in a lobby, because a lawyer had told me it was verified but not yet public, and because I had promised myself I would not become the thing they thought I was. Mr. Wallacehale, Vance said to my son, I'd ask you to step into the side conference room with your father and me. 5 minutes. Whatever you have to say, you can say here. I would strongly advise against that. Say it here. There is no helping a man who insists on the manner of his own ending. Vance did not read a number. He did not open a ledger. He simply said, Are you aware that the Carolina Beach property purchased last month with proceeds from your personal credit facility is titled solely in your wife's name? Nathaniel blinked. We did that for tax. Are you aware? Vance continued, unhurried, that your brother-in-law's development company received 4 transfers from this company's operating account over the past 19 months, coded as regional expansion analysis, and that your wife holds a 20% membership interest in that company, which she acquired 11 months ago, and which she did not disclose to you. The lobby made a sound. Nathaniel turned to look at Vanessa. And Vanessa's face did the thing that no amount of media training prepares you for. It went completely blank for about a second and a half, and then it rearranged itself into outrage. And it was the second and a half that everybody saw. That's a lie, she said. It's a filing, Vance said. It's public. Anyone in this room can look it up on their phone in about 90 seconds. Several of them are doing it now. Marcus was already moving toward the door. Marcus, Claire said. He kept walking. Marcus. He got about 6 feet before he stopped and turned and said the sentence that ended his marriage in front of everyone his wife had ever worked with. I'm not going down for your family. You signed those approvals, not me. And Claire, who had spent 38 years being the quiet one, the one who flinched in doorways, said yes, I did. And I'm going to go tell somebody about it on Monday morning, with a lawyer, and you should think very hard about whether you want to be the one who got there second. He left. Vanessa was still working. That is the part I found genuinely remarkable. Even then, with the room against her and her own filings pulled up on 40 phones, she was still working. Turning toward the reporter from the city paper, mouth opening to reframe, Nathaniel said, Was any of it real? She didn't answer him. She was still looking at the reporter. Vanessa, the beach house, was any of it? Oh, for God's sake, Nathaniel, she said. And it came out of her flat and bored and completely without effort, which was somehow worse than cruelty. You were never going to keep this. Somebody had to plan for after. He sat down. There was no chair behind him. He sat down on the marble floor of the lobby of the building he had borrowed $22 million against, in a $5,000 suit, under a bronze plaque still covered in black cloth with his mother's name on it, and he put both hands over his face. I did not enjoy it. I want to be very clear about that, because I have heard people describe this story back to me as a triumph, and I have never once been able to agree. My son sat down on the floor, and I felt exactly what I felt the first time I ever had to condemn a hull. Not victory. Just the awful settled quiet of finally saying out loud what the Steel had known for years. The reporters were on their phones. The photographer had started shooting again. Vance was quietly instructing one of the accountants to secure the server room, which had already been done, and which I would learn later had been done 4 hours earlier, while the caterers were still setting up. And Ruben Ortega leaned over toward me and said in a low voice, Fulter, the men are asking about Monday. That, right there, was the only question in the building I actually cared about. I asked Vance for the microphone. He raised his eyebrows and then he handed it to me, and I walked past my son on the floor and past my daughter with her ruined face, and I stood under the covered plaque and turned to face 60 people who had spent a month wondering whether they'd have jobs by winter. Nothing changes on Monday, I said. Trucks roll at 4, payroll is funded. It's been funded since the 17th, out of the trust, and it will stay funded. Overtime is reinstated as of tonight and back paid to the day it was cut. Somebody near the back said, yes, out loud, and then looked embarrassed. There's going to be noise, I said. There's going to be lawyers, and there's going to be a story in the paper tomorrow that makes this family look exactly as bad as it is. None of that reaches the yard. If anybody comes to you with a clipboard and a question, you send them to Mr. Vance and you go back to work, and you get paid. I looked at the black cloth over the plaque next to me. One more thing, I said. This was supposed to be a dedication. It's still a dedication. And I pulled the cloth off. The cloth came away, and the room read the plaque before I did. I had never seen it. Margaret had commissioned it 14 months before she died, paid for it out of her own account, rather than the company's, approved the casting and told nobody what it said. I had assumed, the way everyone in that lobby had assumed, that it would say her name and a date. It read, Wallace Regional Freight, 40 years built, by Margaret, and Walter Halsey did the network. He did the load tolerances. Neither one of yous could have done it alone, and only one of yous ever said so. Denise Pryor put her hand over her mouth. Ruben made a sound I had never heard him make in 26 years. I had to put the microphone down on the table because my hand was no longer reliable. She had done it in bronze. Not in a will, not in a press release, not in a conversation we could have had on any of the 4,000 ordinary evenings still available to us, in bronze, bolted to a wall, in a public lobby, in a form that could not be edited, contested, or quietly walked back after she was gone. That was my wife entirely. She spent 40 years letting the world get me wrong, and then made absolutely certain that the correction would outlive every person standing in that room. I took the onion skin paper out of my inside pocket. "There's something else," I said, and my voice was not good, and I did not care. 3 weeks ago I found a letter my wife sewed into the lining of a coat. The coat was in a garbage bag. I bought it back for $8 from a thrift store on Delancey, with a price tag stapled through the collar. Nobody in that lobby moved. I read it out loud, all of it. The part about knowing what our children were capable of. The part about it being easier for the world to accept a woman running a freight empire than to accept that the man behind it never asked for credit. The part where she apologized to me for running out of time. When I got to the last line, "It is yours, Walter. It was always going to be yours," I heard Claire, somewhere behind me, make a sound like something being torn. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. And then my daughter crossed that marble floor at a half-run in front of 4 reporters and 60 employees and her own brother sitting on the ground, and she hit me hard enough that I had to take a step back, and she put her arms around my neck and held on the way she used to when she was 5 and had woken up from something. I want to tell you, I hesitated. I did, for about a second. 40 years of not saying things is a hard habit to put down in a lobby. Then I put my arms around my daughter and held on. She said something into my collar, over and over, that I could not make out at the time and that she has never repeated since. I have my guess. I have decided not to ask behind us quietly. Somebody started clapping, and then everybody did. And it was not the kind of applause you get at a corporate function. It was the kind you get at a graveside when somebody finally says the true thing. The collapse took 11 days, and almost none of it was my doing. That is the part people never believe. They assume I engineered every piece of what happened to my children. I did not. I called in a debt that was legally owed, and I told the truth in a room with a microphone in it. Everything after that was arithmetic. The private lender that had extended Nathaniel $22 million against a building he did not own. Read about the dedication in Tuesday morning's paper. Their compliance department completed the title verification they had deferred, discovered that Meridian Property Holdings had held fee title since 2014, and accelerated the entire facility inside of 6 hours. Because Nathaniel had personally guaranteed it to make the money move faster, the acceleration landed on him, not on any corporate shell. His house went into foreclosure on a Thursday. The cars were repossessed on a Saturday morning while he stood in the driveway in a bathrobe arguing with 2 men who had heard every version of that argument before. Vanessa's 20% interest in Marcus's development company turned out to be worth less than nothing, because the development company was carrying $9 million in construction debt against an unfinished shell outside Charlotte, and had missed its last 3 draws. The beach house in her name was seized to satisfy the personal guarantee she had co-signed in a moment of confidence, which she had apparently forgotten about, and which the lender had not. She filed for divorce 19 days after the dedication and moved to Scottsdale. As far as I know, she and my son have not spoken since. Marcus went to a lawyer first, exactly as he had threatened. It did him less good than he expected. Claire went to a lawyer second, on the Monday morning she promised. With a folder she had assembled herself over a weekend without sleep, and she told them everything, including the parts that were hers. The forensic accountants Vance had brought found that she had signed 11 approvals for transfers she had not read, and 2 she had. She did not contest either count. She lost her seat on the board. She lost the apartment. She took a job doing scheduling for a regional carrier 90 minutes north of the city, which is roughly the job her mother was doing in 1984, and when I offered, because I did offer, twice, she said no. The second time she said no. She said this, "Dad, if you fix this for me, I'll never know if I would have." I did not push after that. She was right, and it was my wife's voice coming out of her mouth, and I was not going to argue with either of them. Nathaniel did not come to the gate. I have read 100 stories where the son comes to the gate and begs, and the father stands behind the iron and delivers a speech, and I understand why people like that ending. It is clean. It gives you a moment to feel the wasteland where it belongs. That is not what happened. What happened is that my son moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a building near the airport, took a job at a logistics brokerage owned by a man who had known his mother and hired him partly out of pity and partly out of curiosity, and did not contact me for 4 months. When he finally did, it was a text message that said, "I don't want anything. I want you to know I'm working." That's all. I did not answer it for 2 days, and I am not proud of the 2 days. Then I wrote back, "Your mother would want to know what you're hauling." He wrote, "Refrigerated produce, mostly. It's harder than it looks." I wrote, "It is." That has been the shape of it since. Short messages, months apart, nothing forgiven and nothing slammed shut either. Once, in February, he asked me a technical question about load distribution on a reefer trailer with an uneven pallet count, and I sat at my kitchen table and typed out 4 paragraphs about weight tolerance, like a man handed back a piece of his own life. He wrote back, "That helped. Thank you. I do not know how that story ends. I am 74. I may not get to find out. I have made my peace with the possibility that the last chapter of my relationship with my son is a text message about refrigerated produce, and I have decided that is not nothing. Here is what I have learned." And then I will tell you the last part. Family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up in the parking lot with a shoebox before they know there's anything in it for them. Claire came to me in a motel lot with her mother's reading glasses when she believed with her whole heart that I had nothing, and that single fact has outweighed, in my accounting, every dollar that changed hands afterward. And silence is not the same as strength. I spent 40 years believing that a man who does not ask for credit is a man with dignity, and what I actually did was raise 2 children on a story about their father that was not true, and then feel wronged when they believed it. If you love somebody, tell them what you gave, not to collect on it, so they know who they are standing next to. I moved back into the house in October, on a Saturday, alone. It was too big for me, and it will always be too big for me. And I have closed off most of the upstairs. And Ines comes twice a week and pretends not to notice that I eat standing up at the counter. The greenhouse is doing well. Margaret's orchids survived a month of neglect out of pure spite, which was also her method. The first thing I did when I got back was carry a coat up to the closet. I had it repaired first. There is a tailor on 9th who specializes in restoration work, and I brought him a navy wool coat with brass buttons and 3 inches of picked stitching in the left panel, and I asked him to close the seam and do nothing else. Not the worn cuffs, not the thinning elbow, nothing. He understood without my explaining it, which is how I knew he was the right tailor. I hung it on the rod in the empty closet. It was the only thing in there. The hanger swung a little when I let go, and ticked once against the wood, and I stood there and let it. Poppy came for a visit the first weekend in November. Claire drove her down and sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee while the 2 of us went upstairs, because Poppy had asked, in the car, on the way, whether Grandpa still had anything of Grandma's, and Claire had told her to go and see. She's 6. She walked into that enormous empty closet and looked at one coat hanging on a rod in the middle of nothing, and she did not find it sad, because 6-year-olds have better instincts than the rest of us. Is that hers? That's hers. She reached up and put her hand flat against the wool and left it there for a second, the way you'd touch a horse. "It smells like the kitchen," she said. "It does." Then she looked up at me with the same expression she'd had on the phone in September, when she asked me the only question in this whole story that ever really mattered. And she said, "So you're the one who remembers her?" "I'm the one who remembers her," I said. She thought about that. "I'll help," she said, "and that is where I'll leave it." An old man and a small girl standing in an empty closet in front of one navy coat with brass buttons, worth $8 at a thrift store on Delancey, and worth more than $32 million to everyone standing in that room. They gave away everything my wife owned before they buried her. They never checked the lining.